When we attempt to interpret a prophecy or a passage from the Old Testament, we usually look at what the New Testament writers said about it. So how does Jesus and his disciples explain Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy? Most end-time scholars today believe that Daniel's 70 weeks in Daniel 9 are the most important prophecy in the Bible, fully explaining the end times. However, not a single epistle refers to this prophecy directly by name. Why? That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. We asked this same question in the first chapter of our 2017 book, 70 times 7, which is all about the 70 weeks prophecy. And frankly, the answer is a bit of a mystery. Something so fundamental as Daniel's 70 weeks should be primary in all discussions of end times, and even in regards to the first coming of Christ. Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the two epistles most heavily weighted toward eschatology, yet he appears to say not a thing about it. Peter seems to ignore it as well, and John seems to avoid it in Revelation, even though he quotes the Old Testament over 500 times in that book. Now we say they appear to avoid it. They actually discuss it, but the discussion is veiled, as you will soon see. For this reason, there is still great disagreement about the 70 weeks in the church today. Was it fulfilled in the first century, or is it future? Is the prince who is to come the Antichrist or someone else? And even, when does the rapture happen? All these things are answered by Jesus and the disciples, but they must be hidden pretty well, or we wouldn't have as much disagreement in the church. Now, God may have another plan as well for how he plans to reveal the 70 weeks and what it means. And the answer might be both. There might be references to the 70 weeks that are hidden in the New Testament. We're going to go over those today. And God might have another plan. So what is that other plan? We know from Daniel 12:4 that God has sealed the book of Daniel until the end times. We also know that God is sending two prophets, two witnesses during the 70th week of Daniel. So it's our personal opinion that any questions about the 70th week not explained by the Bible might be explained by these two witnesses. At least that's our guess. But since the two witnesses are not here yet, let's spend this video examining what the New Testament and the disciples do say about the 70 weeks prophecy. Daniel was Jesus' go-to prophet when it came to the end times. So it makes sense that Jesus would be the one referring to the 70 weeks the most, and he is. And he is also the one that directly mentions Daniel by name. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So Jesus not only refers us to Daniel, he specifically says he wants us to understand it by studying it. And the concept of the abomination that causes desolation that Jesus mentions in Matthew is found in the 70 weeks. So that reference in Matthew is the second most blatant reference in the New Testament to Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. But there is an even more direct reference. The more direct reference actually mentions the 70 weeks by name. But strangely, at least to me, the reference is missed by nearly every scholar on the planet. In fact, I bet if you don't follow this ministry, you probably have never associated this passage with the 70 weeks prophecy. And I'm sure this is going to be eye-opening to you. Peter came and said to him, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. I know this is such a strange passage. 70 times 7. Everyone should be questioning why Jesus is giving us a multiplication problem. If he wanted to pick a large number, why not say something like 1,000 times or even 7,000 times? Why 70 times 7? Or why didn't Jesus say we were always to forgive. Why give a number at all? The answer is Jesus isn't giving us some random big number, as so many seem to believe today, but he is referring us to the 70 weeks prophecy. A week of years is 7 years, and 70 of them are what the 70 weeks prophecy is all about. They are 7 weeks times 70 times, or 70 times 7. Jesus is in essence telling Peter and us to forgive others until the end of the 70 weeks prophecy. Wow. This radical new understanding of that verse has profound implications on whether the 70 weeks prophecy was fulfilled in the first century or whether it will be fulfilled in the future. In fact, this understanding answers that question. When you think that 70 times 7 is just a random big number, then either end time point of view for the 70 weeks prophecy is possible. However, if Jesus is telling us we are to forgive up until the end of the 70th week of Daniel, and maybe not after that, then this can only be a future time, because obviously we are to be forgiving others right now during what most call the church age. And this makes perfect sense. We are to forgive, and Jesus forgives until he returns on his white horse to fight Armageddon. Up until that point, forgiveness is still possible. Repentance can take place right up until the end of the 70th week. And we can verify that this is what Jesus meant by looking at how Peter asked his original question. Peter asked if we are to forgive 7 times. Again, everyone seems to think this is just a random number. But this isn't a random number. This is a week of years, 7 years. The Hebraic calendar was divided into 7-year groupings called Shabuah. And in the final year of each Shabuah was a year known as the Shemitah year. Hebrews were to forgive their financial debts in that year. Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 2. You can see Peter was probably applying this principle to forgiving sin as well during that year, the 7th year. 7 times, as he calls it. Jesus' answer then is perfectly timed. In essence, he is saying, not 1 Shabuah, Peter, not 1 week, but 70 weeks. All the way to the end of the 70 weeks prophecy. So in this interchange, Jesus also answers for us that the 70th final week of Daniel is a future occurrence. This might be one of the biggest questions Christians have about the 70th week in particular. If we are to forgive only up until the end of the 70 weeks, then it couldn't have been in the first century, because we're supposed to be forgiving right now. So if Jesus is referring to the 70th week in this passage about 70 times 7, then there's no way that the 70th week could have happened back in the first century. And there are actually 11 other reasons that it couldn't have happened back in the first century, and we mentioned these in the book that we discussed at the beginning of the video, our book 70 times 7. Jesus had other teachings about the 70 weeks. In his final week of ministry, what we call Holy Week, Jesus' teachings became very focused on his coming sacrifice and atonement for sin. This, of course, is mentioned in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. That's looking forward to his coming death. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. In this verse, Daniel tells us that after the first 69 weeks of the prophecy, the Messiah will be cut off or die. The city and temple will be destroyed, and desolations will occur. In other words, the Israelites will be exiled from the city. That's what desolations is implying. Jesus spoke of these things in his final 7 days of ministry, and by doing so, he was identifying for his listeners where they were in the scope of the prophecy. When he died, the 69 weeks would have been completed. In the parable of the landowner in Matthew 21, Jesus spoke of the tenants killing the son. This is the cutting off of the Messiah. In the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22, Jesus spoke of the king sending his servants and armies to burn and destroy the city. This is the destruction of the city and temple by the people of the prince. And on the last day, Jesus spoke to the Pharisees. He said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." And there is the desolation spoke of. So in that last week of ministry, Jesus brought up all the major points of Daniel 9:26. These references by Jesus were not missed by the disciples. They understood he was speaking of a 70 weeks prophecy. And after Jesus reinforced this by telling them that not a single stone of the temple would be left upon another, they knew it, because there it was, the destruction of the city and the temple. So when they were alone, they immediately asked him about the destruction of a temple and the final week, the 70th week of Daniel, which they assumed was going to happen right away. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming?" That's going to be super important. Where did they get the idea that Jesus was coming back? And the end of the age. Now, when we read this in English, we don't get the idea that the disciples were asking about the 69th and 70th weeks of Daniel, but they were. When they asked, "When will these things happen?" they were referring to Jesus' mention of not one stone of the temple being left upon another. They knew this is what happened after the 69th week, when the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and sanctuary. In the parable of the wedding feast, the disciples had also heard Jesus say that the king would send his armies to destroy the city, and realized this army was the reference to the people of the prince who is to come, destroying the city and temple. The disciples rightly understood that the prince who is to come was the king in that parable, the Messiah. So this also explains why they asked, what would be the sign of Jesus' coming? He was the prince who is to come, so they knew he was coming. This is a very, very poorly understood point today, but the disciples realized it back in the first century because they don't have thousands of years of Christian tradition marring their understanding. Then they asked about the end of the age. Now this doesn't sound like the 70th week of Daniel stuff at all, but it is. The Greek phrase, soon tilias, tau anianos, is found in Daniel 9:27. It literally means consummation of the ages. In the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament, Daniel 9:27 uses a very similar phrase, the appointed time of consummation. It is used in this way, "And on the holy place will be the abomination of desolation." That's what Jesus said to refer back to Daniel about, until the appointed time of consummation. So it really seems this is what the disciples were referring to. And Jesus used this phrase, consummation of the ages, 2 other times in the book of Matthew. In the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13, Jesus told us the harvest, or the resurrection and rapture, is the consummation of the ages. And in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, he instructed the disciples that he will be with us, meaning Christians, even to the consummation of the ages. So the consummation of the ages is the return of Jesus on the clouds in great glory and the events associated with it. And since the disciples asked their questions couched in language about the 70 weeks prophecy, that means, of course, that the 70th week of Daniel is what Jesus was discussing in the Olivet Discourse. And we have already confirmed that when mentioning the abomination of desolation that will stand on the holy place, Jesus specifically tells the disciples it's found in the book of Daniel. The whole thing is about the 70th week of Daniel. And in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, which is slightly different than Matthew's, Jesus quotes a different portion of the 70 weeks prophecy. These are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. All things written that will be fulfilled is the same idea as to seal up vision and prophecy from Daniel 9:24, one of the major impacts of the 70 weeks. Again, Jesus is telling the disciples by quoting the 70 weeks prophecy, but that's what this is all about. So although Jesus doesn't directly mention the 70 weeks in this section, the Olivet Discourse, all that he spoke of that day involves this prophecy from Daniel. Jesus gave a most detailed explanation of the 70th week. We don't always recognize it as such because it is so detailed and provides so much new information that's not in the original passage in Daniel that sometimes we miss it. What about the Apostle Paul? He was such an important writer in the New Testament. Certainly, he must have had something to say about the 70 weeks prophecy. Well, one thing he did say about it will probably stun you because it's in a spot you absolutely don't expect it. In 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul discusses the revealing of the Antichrist in that chapter at the abomination of desolation. The man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Although this is almost universally thought to take place at the abomination of desolation, at the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel, there is hidden proof of this a little later in the exact same passage. And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. The proof may be hidden in this very challenging translation of this very strange phrase, taken out of the way. Let's look at the literal meaning of this phrase in the Greek. Heos ek mesu generahi. Literally, this means until out of the middle he becomes. You notice the word taken isn't found anywhere in this strange passage. No one appears to be taken anywhere. Someone becomes in the midst or in the middle. In the middle of what? No wonder translators have had such a hard time with this phrase. The original translators assumed the middle of the way or the middle of the road, that something was in the way. But what if it's the middle of the 70th week of Daniel? Who appears at the middle of the 70th week? Why, the man of sin does. He is revealed at the abomination of desolation that Daniel 9:27 tells us happens at the midpoint of a 70th week. Can you see what a better sense this makes than our current thinking? That the he becomes or happens or appears in the middle. It isn't the one restraining. It's the man of sin that is a major topic of this discussion in 2 Thessalonians 2. And this fits perfectly with the context of the man of sin being revealed when he sits in the holy place of God at the abomination of desolation, as Daniel 9:27 tells us, at the midpoint, literally in the midst, one who makes desolate comes. Who is this? Well, of course, it's the Antichrist, who makes or causes the desolation of Jerusalem. So this fits perfectly with the revealing of Antichrist at the midpoint. In the book of Revelation, this timetable is confirmed. We read that the Gentiles will trample the city for 42 months, 3.5 years, the middle of a 7-year period. However, as we said at the beginning of this video, there are many aspects of this prophecy that aren't fully discussed by Jesus or the disciples or anywhere else in the Old Testament either. Our opinion is that the two witnesses will be the ones to discuss this. But who are they? Are they Elijah and Moses, Elijah and Enoch, or maybe they're two groups of persons? Click right here to keep watching to see who they likely will be and when they likely will minister. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.